Could the Denver Broncos be on the verge of making some salary cap cuts ahead of the start of free agency? We take a look at some potential players on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The Broncos could be close to making some salary cap cuts ahead of NFL free agency. They could also be taking a look at some potential options on the coaching side of things, which is taking some time. Should Broncos Country worry about that? Thank you so much for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format. Or if you like to watch us, you can watch us every day on YouTube. Hit that subscribe or that follow button down below so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. I'm your host, as always, Cody, Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports. Joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and good friend, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, no news yet on the Broncos coaching search, defensive coordinator, offensive coordinator. We're just about a week away from the NFL scouting combine, and I think a lot of people in Broncos country are concerned about the timeline, but to be honest with you, Sayre, from my perspective, I'm not necessarily worried about it right now for the Broncos, and I can't wait to dive into it, why I feel that way with you and everybody in Broncos country.
Me too, Cody. I'm excited to continue talking about this. Look, I think as of right now, what is there to really worry about, right? Unless you really feel like the Broncos are getting passed up by the best candidates. That's where I'm coming down with this. It's like if the best possible people for the job are being, if they're saying, I don't want to go to Denver, and maybe you could make that argument, right? I mean, would you say, Vic Fangio, that was kind of a unique circumstance. So maybe you give Sean Payton and these guys a bit of a pass on that one if he was the top target. But then maybe Brian Flores, do you say, well, if he was the top target, he passed up the Broncos for the Vikings? I don't exactly know. I don't know where they're at with the presumptive favorite. Remember from the very beginning was besides Fangio, it was then Sean Desai, at least from the reports that we had seen. So unless you're really concerned that the Broncos are getting passed up on by the top candidates, and up to this point, I don't know that. I feel like a lot of the best candidates are still available and in the mix. I think that's really the only reason to be concerned. And as of right now, I just don't know. Is that cause for concern, right? I mean, Sean Payton said that he was going to take his time with this process. And I think that that's a good thing, right? It's not like they're going to make bad hires, in my opinion, at this point, at least based on who's still out there.
Well, I think you also... There's no major players that are going to start emerging out of the woodworks, suddenly saying, oh, this is a new potential candidate. Like, the market is the market right now, right? For guys that are out there. I think when you look at offensive coordinator, you look at defensive coordinator, there's nobody new that's coming out of the woodwork out of nowhere, and I think that's something that's important to highlight. Now, for me, that's why I'm not concerned. Because the market is exactly what it is. The candidates are exactly who they are. And while there's a lot of talk about Vance Joseph, there's a lot of talk about Rex Ryan, there hasn't been a lot of talk about Sean Desai, which to me, Sayre, kind of tells me like he could be the favorite. He really could, because as we know, nothing is coming out of the Broncos building. They're not telling anybody anything, not even the NFL Network insiders. Like, when they want them to know, they're going to find out, and they're going to be told by George Payton, by Sean Payton, or by somebody in that building. But it's not going to come out to local media first, unless there's like some sort of super connection to a super agent or something like that. But this is a process that has taken its time, and granted, Broncos country wants it to happen. Sayre, I remember during the head coach search, everybody, and I think ourselves included, were saying, why is it taking so long? But you know what? At the end of the day, what happened? Everything worked out. Sean Payton was named the head coach. As it pertains to coordinator, I'm not necessarily as worried about them not moving so fast to get an offensive coordinator, because we know Sean Payton is going to be calling the plays. We know that Sean Payton is going to be in charge of the passing offense for Denver. defensive coordinator is the one where I think there aren't as many candidates out there that you are hoping for, but we know who they are, and so far no other teams have made moves on them. We know Vance Joseph has had interviews with the Eagles. We know that Sean Desai's had an interview with the Eagles as well. Until one of these guys gets moved off the chessboard here, Sayre, I'm not necessarily going to be worried. However, let's say we find out that the Broncos' top target was this guy, and he goes somewhere else. Then I would say, okay, why did it take so long? Why couldn't you just come in and make an offer? It doesn't seem like that is really an issue in the eyes of the Broncos right now. And while I know it's frustrating for the fans, I understand it.
Yeah, and it kind of speaks to the idea, like, remember, we had kind of thought going into this whole process, like, hey, this Broncos ownership group, they're paying all sorts of money to upgrade the stadium, get a new field in there, and they're willing to go up to $20 to $25 million a year for either Sean Payton or Jim Harbaugh. Have they been drawing a line in the sand a bit financially? Because if money was of no consequence here, wouldn't the Broncos just be throwing out hey, look at, we have the best offer out there and we can top whatever the best other offer you're going to get is. We want Sean Payton to bring in whoever he wants. And maybe they have done that for certain candidates. Like maybe Vic Fangio did get a really good offer from the Broncos and pass it up to go to Miami instead. We don't know those things, but it kind of speaks to the fact that we're waiting still. Sean Payton has been hired now for about 3 weeks, 3+ weeks, and he hasn't made a coordinator hire. Kind of speaks to this idea that maybe the ownership group is saying, hey, let's be a little more patient with this instead of just say, hey, we got the Brinks truck backed up. How much money do you want to come be offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator? So it's become a bit more complicated. And I think maybe does that Eagles job as well, that Eagles defensive coordinator position, does that loom a bit large in this? Because I mean, it may be attractive to go work for the NFC champions, right? I mean, the Broncos, they were 5-12 last year, although I'm repping the Super Bowl gear here from a couple of different eras. The Broncos were 5-12 last year, and the Eagles were one of the best teams in the NFL. So that could loom large in this. Not saying it's necessarily just a better job flat out given their personnel, but you never know. Maybe a coordinator feels like, hey, that's a quick path for me to become a head coach, and they're kind of waiting to see how that all shakes out. So there's factors at play here that maybe the Broncos, maybe they don't get the. In fact, I would argue they're not going to get their first option. I do think their first option, or Sean Payton's first option, was Vic Fangio. So behind him, it's kind of like, who's the best candidate going to be? They've interviewed a bunch of people. Now's the time we're going to find out, okay, who really wants this job the most. It's going to be fascinating to find out, Cody. As Gary Kubiak always used to say, we're fixing to find out.
I ain't tripping, man. I'm going to let the process play out, and I imagine, let's say best case scenario, Friday, Saturday, we find out who the Broncos DC is, maybe even earlier, hopefully. Worst case scenario, we find out before the NFL Scouting Combine next week. I don't think it's going to necessarily change much because, as we all know, the Broncos don't have a first or second round pick, so a lot of that evaluation will, be conducted by Brian Stark, by George Payton. I trust the process where things are at right now. We'll see how things play out. But one thing that could be coming up here, Broncos Country, there could be some salary cap cuts, as we've already seen around the NFL. Some teams have made some cuts to free up some cap space. Who could the Broncos be potentially looking at? You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, and the midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, it's secure, it's super easy to use, and then you could bet on everything from the money line to point scores to threes drained in a game. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. As NFL free agency creeps up a little bit closer, the Broncos could make several cuts that could add to more cap space to what they already have. Who are some names that they could be potentially looking at, and what might that forecast look like for the Broncos? Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you watch on YouTube. We appreciate you so much for taking time out of your day to listen or to watch us break down all things related to the Denver Broncos every single day, all year long, because for the true fan, there's never an off season. Salary cap cuts are something that are widely popular around the NFL right before free agency. And Sayre, we already saw the Tennessee Titans make some big-time moves, big-time cuts this past week to free up cap space ahead of all the festivities here in just about 2.5 weeks' time. Who could be some potential cap cuts for the Broncos, and what might that do for their outlook in free agency and also with cap space?
Well, they could significantly boost their cap space. And right now, Cody, they're not in bad shape by any means. I mean, more than half the league is just barely hovering around even on the salary cap, right? So it's not like every team is flush with cap space. The Broncos currently sit at 12th in the NFL with about 12 million in cap space, 11.95 million according to SpotTrack. But they could easily get up to over 30 million by, first of all, I think letting go of someone like Glasgow, who we know they restructured his deal last year. He could save them 11 million if they cut him outright. Chase Edmonds could save nearly 6 million if they let him go and just kind of cut him and see, hey, do we want to bring him back at a later time? Or if they want to restructure his deal, they could certainly try to do that. And by restructure, of course, you mean pay cut. And, you know, some guys you restructure, some guys you just ask to take a pay cut. He would probably be of the pay cut variety. Ronald Darby is another one, Cody. I know we've talked about his name being interesting, especially if Rex Ryan comes aboard. The Broncos could save over 9 million if they cut him or trade him. So he's an interesting name. I don't know, though. Do you cut a guy who's as good at his job as Ronald Darby just for that cap? I mean, I don't know. The Broncos do need to reallocate funds to the offensive side of the ball, specifically on the offensive line, but that's a pretty hefty price to pay.
No, it is, and you have to evaluate, you know, if we get rid of this guy, like, is the guy behind him really good? And we've talked about this, you know, earlier this week. Damari Mathis can start, I think, opposite Patrick Surtain. We saw it last year, and he played at a high level. You have K'Wan Williams in the nickel. The only question I have, and this is the question that we've had even with Ronald Darby, what does your depth look like behind Surtain and a guy like Mathis if you do cut a guy like Darby, right? Yes, while you can free up cap space, that's always nice because it gives you more flexibility. And I agree with you. I think that Denver has to allocate some of those funds to the offensive side of the ball, not all towards Russell Wilson, right? But you have to look at some offensive line options, maybe running back, maybe wide receiver. There's so many things that Denver can do if they were to make this move. Now, let's say that the four guys that you talked about, right? Let's talk about the Glasgows, the Chase Edmonds, Ronald Darbys, and even another guy, surprise guy, Brandon McManus, who we know has kind of been up and down. He's been hit or miss the last couple of years. If you include him with that, the Broncos cap space would jump. It would be at like $11.95 million, as you mentioned. It would jump all the way up to about $32 million. Do you know what you could do with $32 million in terms of flexibility? You give George Payton and Rich Hurtado $32 million to work with, and they're going to make some things happen for you. So for me, and you also talk about, we're not even factoring guys restructuring their contracts. Denver could very well, if they were to make some of these salary cap cuts, restructure a couple of contracts, they could very well get up to $45 million. They could get up to $50 million. Are they going to do that? It's unlikely, but I think you have to make a big splash. You just brought in Sean Payton as your head coach. You signed Russell Wilson to a massive contract. Your window to win is in this 2 to 4 year window, and you have to find a way to strike gold now, or at least start getting the iron hot a little bit. To me, I think that's interesting, and it could also lead to some surprise cuts.
It could. Maybe somebody like Garrett Bowles, right, who we've talked about before as his name kind of popping up in trade rumors. And what are trade rumors usually? They're usually a precursor to a guy being on the block one way or the other, whether that's, you know, the trade block or the chopping block entirely. You can't help but wonder, like you said, they could get up close to $45-50 million pretty quickly, especially if Garrett Bowles is part of their roster cuts. And I know a lot of people are like, well, what are they supposed to do at left? You're creating an additional need on the offensive line when you already have multiple needs. Look, there's going to be a plan. There's going to be players that they could bring in. Like, it's not just Garrett Bowles is the only option at left tackle. There's no way they're going into this offseason believing that unless, man, I could be very mistaken, and maybe they love Garrett Bowles. Maybe the pro scouting department is like, there's no way we're moving on from Bowles, and I'm completely wrong. But he's on the wrong side of 30. He's one of the biggest cap hits on the team, coming off a major injury. You can save almost $10 million by cutting or trading him. I just think the writing is on the wall there to go with a potentially cheaper option, or maybe you go for a bigger option in free agency, depending on who other teams are looking to cut. One way or another, you do have that flexibility, like you mentioned. You could have a $17 million cap hit for Garrett Bowles, or you could look at somebody else. Maybe Tyron Smith, for example, gets cut by the Cowboys. You sign him to a 2-year deal, whatever the case may be. You could get his cap hit way down low for this season. So I'm just throwing things out there, Cody, but there's different ways that the Broncos can go about rebuilding this offensive line. And I guarantee you, Sean Payton is going to be coming in after evaluating that O-line. He already said it himself. That's where he sees that they need to improve a lot, is on the offensive line. So get Zach Strief, some new big boys up front. I wouldn't be surprised if Quinn Miners was the only holdover, opening day starter from last season to enter the 2022 or 2023 season for the Denver Broncos.
Well, and there are some other guys right now in the Broncos practice squad, guys that you can develop, right? I'm not saying that you're going to thrust Will Sherman into the starting lineup at offensive tackle. I mean, I'm not suggesting that one way or the other. But you also have another free agent in Calvin Anderson, who has shown he is more than capable of playing left tackle. Heck, he started there various times last season. The year before, he started against Micah Parsons, Randy Gregory, DeMarcus Lawrence, and held his own against them when the Broncos had that upset victory against the Cowboys. We've seen him step up there when Garrett Bowles got food poisoning against the Panthers a few years ago in the Drew Lock 3-touchdown game, the 2 to KJ Hamler. Wow, how far have we come from those times here, Sayre? But Calvin Anderson is an option that you absolutely should look at. If you do plan on moving on from Garrett Bowles, you should be bringing back Calvin Anderson. He should be your starter at left tackle. Maybe you re-sign Billy Turner or Cam Fleming on a 1 or 2 year deal, and then they're your right tackle, because those are really the positions that aren't. There isn't anybody out there unless, as you alluded to, somebody gets cut from another team, right? And that's going to be very unlikely in some situations. So the free agency market at tackle isn't that great. It isn't strong. Bring back guys you're familiar with that can get the job done, and then look to boost the interior, because there are really good interior offensive linemen available in this NFL free agency cycle. There could be some surprise cuts as well. That has to be the number one priority for the Broncos this offseason, is finding out what the solution is on the offensive line. And it may require, as you said, to cut bait with some guys that, have had some prestige here, like Garrett Bowles, which we love Garrett Bowles, 110%. But we also understand it from a football team building aspect of it. I could see why that could be in the cards for Denver, for George Payton, for Sean Payton. It's an entirely new regime. Nobody is safe. It's evaluation season already, and it's all based on stuff that they did last year. So all of these things considered, there will be some potential moves coming up, restructures, salary cap cuts. We'll have you covered every step of the way here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. But Broncos Country, on today's episode of the show, what is the latest with the coordinator search at DC with OC? Who are some names? Are there any new names to consider for the Broncos in these positions? You'll get that on today's episode of the show. I wanted to tell you real quick about the Locked On Podcast Network and what we have going on here. If you're a Colorado sports fan, we have a Locked On podcast for you. If you're a Broncos fan, obviously you're tuned in. You're locked in every day here, Locked On Broncos. But if you're a Denver Nuggets fan, we have Locked On Nuggets. If you're a Colorado Rockies fan, we have Locked On Rockies. We have the Locked On Avalanche podcast as well, and we just launched the Locked On Buffs podcast to cover everything that's going on in Boulder with the arrival of primetime Deion Sanders as their head coach. You get all the action here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. What is the latest on the Broncos offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator search regarding names that we know, and could there be some new names that could emerge? Thank you so much once again, Broncos Country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Sayre, let's dive into this, because as we know, the top names for the Broncos DC search, we know Sean Desai, Vance Joseph, and we know Rex Ryan. Realistically, that has been it. That's been the three publicized names that we've talked about outside of the Vic Fangios, who we knew, that was in the works there. Sean Payton's interest in keeping Ejiro Evero. Mike Kliss, our good friend at 9 News, made a very interesting mention on one of the news broadcasts here for 9 News on his Kliss and Tell segment with Rod Mackey about another name that I don't think we anticipated or even want. To be honest with you, I want the Broncos to stay away from this option.
Yeah, Matt Patricia was the name he threw out there, right? I mean, last I heard, he was getting considered as potentially being the offensive coordinator of the Patriots. What were those talks last year with him and potentially Joe Judge? I don't know what the Patriots ended up doing. I don't think Mac Jones really liked it, whatever it was. But yeah, Matt Patricia being the defensive coordinator, obviously he was good enough in New England to get the head coaching gig once upon a time with the Detroit Lions. And so he would kind of fit into that category, I guess, of being the head coach of the defense, which is what I think Sean Payton really does want. I think he wants to be able to kind of just set it and forget it on that side of the ball, not necessarily to have no say in the way things are going over there, but really to have somebody, he needs to focus a lot on the offense and really developing those players, getting things back to a point of competency. Whereas the defense, I mean, we've seen Vic Fangio comes in, the defense plays well. Even at times under Vance Joseph, the defense played very well when there was a transition of a lot of players there. And you know, obviously we saw last year, Ejiro Evero, the defense played very well for him. So the Broncos have guys on that side of the ball to be able to trust with the right DC that Sean Payton really wouldn't have to meddle too much with that. So Matt Patricia is an interesting name. Kind of makes you wonder. I mean, we haven't heard much about Mike Zimmer lately. Could that kind of resurface itself a little bit as well? I don't know. Another a former player who there was some news that came out, Cody, about a former Denver Broncos player. Matter of fact, I remember when he signed with the team back in 2012. I was in Colorado when it happened. Jim Leonhard. There's some interesting stuff going on about him. I thought he was already locked in as somebody's defensive coordinator at the college level or a head coach at the college level. Apparently, I don't pay close enough attention to the goings on of college football, but Jim Leonhard, his name has started to creep up for other teams. Makes you wonder, could he return to Denver?
Well, I think a great question, right? Because initially he was supposed to have hip surgery because he was a DC at Wisconsin, right? And obviously they have a new regime and things like that. They made a lot of changes. He's very well regarded. And a lot of people consider him the next big thing to come from the college ranks to coach in the NFL. What he's able to do, I mean, even like Faion Hicks was on Twitter broadcast like, hey, come to Denver. You know, I think it's always something to note there. But he runs a pro-style defense, you know, so guys come into it, you know, from Wisconsin, they feed into the NFL, and they're ready to play in what the NFL demands defensively, specifically on the defensive side of the ball, the secondary linebacker position. Those positions tend to thrive the most there. And Jim Leonhard, as you mentioned, with former ties to Denver as a former safety. I remember that time. I remember his time as a member of the New York Jets. For me, the question is, like, for a guy like that, do you bring him in as a DC or do you bring him in kind of like a senior role at first, right? You know, maybe pair him up, as we mentioned. Maybe you pair Jim Leonhard up with a Christian Parker, and then you see how things go. Christian Parker's obviously going to generate interest from other NFL teams after a while if the Broncos secondary continues to thrive. And then all of a sudden, Jim Leonhard steps into the full-time defensive coordinator role. I mean, you could do something like that. I mean, the NFL hasn't been a stranger to co-coordinators as of late. The Saints had co-defensive coordinators. They had co-offensive coordinators. So I think that is something to keep an eye on here. I wouldn't be opposed to Jim Leonhard. I think that his name is very hot. He's a very smart football mind, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Shifting gears now to the offensive side of the ball, I still think that David Shaw is still heavily in play for the Broncos. And you know what intel they have? Well, guess what? They interviewed him for the head coaching position. They asked him about his plans for the offensive side of the ball. It could coincide perfectly well with Sean Payton, who obviously has close ties and a good relationship with David Shaw.
And I would love to see that. Absolutely. Especially when you talk about some of the player connections that he will have around the league and just his eye for evaluating talent. I know I've mentioned that before, but for anybody who wasn't around listening when we were doing the whole head coaching interview process and talking about that, David Shaw does a very, very good job when he's on the NFL Network at knowing other teams' needs, knowing how a player could fit with certain coaches. Like, he's very well plugged in to the NFL and does a tremendous job during the NFL draft. So I love listening to his insight when it comes to college football players, when it comes to scouting, just kind of how guys could fit translating to the next level. I think he's very sharp in that regard. And what do the Broncos really need offensively right now? They need more people that can help develop young talent. They need more people that can get the best out of the players. I think David Shaw would be a really great person to have around. He's just a tremendous leader, tremendous football mind. He's been around it all. He's somebody that, man, his teams at Stanford, at their best, Cody, what were they always on both sides of the ball? They were just tough. They're just tough offensively, building really good units in the trenches. He sent a lot of NFL guys, whether it was, you think about some of those guys that he had on the offensive line. Andrews Pete comes to mind when you're talking about connections to Sean Payton. Obviously, he coached Andrew Luck. He coached a lot of NFL guys at Stanford, Christian McCaffrey. So he knows how to evaluate talent and to build up guys at a program where you have a ton of restrictions at Stanford, right? So I like David Shaw being on the staff in some capacity for sure.
Well, and I think he'd be the perfect guy to design a run game, right? And someone's like, well, hire him as the run game coordinator. They don't really do that often in the NFL. They don't really hire a guy to be a run game coordinator. You see that at the college level. You see it at the high school level a lot. But in the NFL, you have your offensive coordinator, and realistically, you have the passing game coordinator. That stuff is probably a little bit more important. But you have a guy who could work really well with Sean Payton and making sure that whatever Payton wants to run offensively, as we all know he's going to be calling, take care of business, make things happen. So for me, I think there's a lot of things the Broncos should consider as it pertains to their search here. As we know, they have interviewed Matt Patricia, which, is interesting, isn't inspiring on paper, but you know what? Maybe we'll get proven wrong, and maybe we'll find out here shortly who the next Broncos defensive coordinator will be. With that said, Broncos Country, thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of the show. We appreciate you so much. You love this episode. Make sure you hit that like button on YouTube, comment, and interact with other members in Broncos Country. And if you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform, you can always tweet us at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. And if you would leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, it would mean the absolute world to Sayre and myself. If you love the show, leave us 5 stars. Tell you why you tune in every single day. We appreciate you so much. We'll be back tomorrow with a brand new episode of the show.